The News, a user's manual, is offered as a guide as to how to deal with the constant barrage of news that we face in our daily lives. The book's author, philosopher Alain de Botton, is here with us tonight to tell us what the steady stream of information is doing to our minds and our lives. Hello, welcome back. You've been on the agenda before, but not on the agenda this summer.
Exactly.
Welcome to summer.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so we're going to spend the next half hour talking about the news, its shortcomings, how we can fix it, what makes it compelling or not. But I want to begin by asking you, how do you define news? What are we talking about?
Deliberately in the book, I didn't draw a distinction between online, radio, television, print, because in a way, we speak about it just casually as the news. You know, you wouldn't go, I've heard on the news that somebody died. You go, was that on the web or was that in a newspaper? You go, I don't know, it was just in the news. So we, as consumers of the news, speak about this generic category. And that's what I wanted to capture in the book, that it's just one thing. And it comes at us, it's a 24-hour operation, we're obsessed with it, it drives us crazy.
It's interesting that you say that you know, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, and yet we haven't really agreed upon what we're talking about in terms of the news. Is that part of the challenge here?
Well, I think what we haven't decided necessarily as a society is what news is for. So it has an incredible prestige in society. So the news, you know, we're going to hear the news headlines, right? And of course, it's never the news. It's only ever some news masquerading as the whole thing. But it's assumed this idea in our minds that somehow, you know, God or his replacement is talking to us, telling us what happened, who was murdered, how the budget's doing, you know, what's happening in China, etc. That these are, as it were, the inviolable and necessary, most important stories. And of course, you don't have to think about it for a few minutes to realize that it's nothing of the sort. These things are made up by people like you or colleagues, you know, in a room.
I won't take it personally.
Don't take it personally, but you know, you guys are making it up, and not making it up, but you're selecting. You're making real decisions that are, on the whole, not explained, and the audience just takes it all in, and doesn't really think, hang on a minute, do we need to hear about this murder? What's it for, etc. So there's a kind of overall idea. The news is very important. You need to hear it, but really, the connection between that big, almost philosophical dream and the reality of the nightly news bulletin is very rarely examined.
Okay, let me challenge you on your profession, which is philosophy. Yep. I mean, maybe you're just overthinking this thing. I mean, the news is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. Why do we need a guide to something that we have, I guess, in some way, tacitly accepted as just exists? You want to think about it deeper.
Yeah, it's the most important force in society. If you wanted to start a revolution in Toronto, maybe we do, where would you drive your tank? You wouldn't go to the home of the political theorists, the philosophers, the poets, the artists, the fashion designers. No, you would take your tank to only one destination, which is the headquarters of the media. If you control the media, you control people's brains. And in Canada and in other advanced democracies, there are interest groups that control bits of our brains. And when we go to school, people spend an enormous amount of time trying to get us to understand Shakespeare and bits of literature and you know, the arts, etc. But no one ever systematically takes us through an education in this business of media saturation. And so we tend to think of the news as just obvious, and we don't understand that it is fundamentally wiring our minds in such a way that certain questions seem possible. You know, if I started talking about wage distribution and how wages are distributed, a certain bit of it would be acceptable in the news, would be part of the news item, and then there are things that are not really part of the news agenda. So in other words, when economic news is reported, it tends to be within very strict boundaries. You can mention inflation, you can mention the unemployment rate, but if somebody stood back and went, what's all this for? What are we doing, killing ourselves with this economic system, abusing others, exploiting the earth, etc.? Immediately switch off, this sounds weird, you know, etc. If you want to talk about the education system, and you suddenly started saying, not how many teachers should there be in the classroom, etc., but you started saying, what is education for? What are we really aiming at? What's life about? You know, again, wouldn't fit the news agenda. So there is a subtle form of censorship. Now, people think censorship, oh, that's the old Soviet Union. No, censorship is alive and well in Canada. And indeed, in all democracies, it's just an inner little censor that goes, no, our viewers wouldn't like that, or it doesn't quite seem to fit. But that's censorship. It's alive and well right here.
Okay. I want to pick on you a little bit more, because arguably you could say, okay, the news is only a slice, it's headlines, it's some news, as you say. Shows like this, Current Affairs, is where we get to ask the deeper questions about education or wage inequality or whatnot. So maybe it's just not part of the news.
The problem is no one's watching us. Our audience is tiny, and that's really sad. Partly because you've chosen the wrong sofa, and it's a little bit boring.
Is that what we're doing wrong?
It's a little bit boring. I mean, I'm having a lovely time, and I'm really pleased to be here. But like, it's not a mass show. So there's almost an idea that when you want to discuss really serious, weighty issues, make sure you put them late at night, and make sure they get quite a. When is this going out?
8 o'clock.
It's 8 o'clock. Okay, great. Keep the audience relatively small. I'm talking about the mass media, the things that get onto the mass media. So, of course, there are blogs out there that will discuss, oil revenues and what they mean. And but the mainstream news agenda, and let's not forget, there is still something called the mainstream news agenda, because people nowadays go, well, what about Twitter and what about Facebook? And we're all making up our own news. Well, look, think about the financial crisis in the United States. Despite Twitter and Facebook and all the rest of it, there was such a thing as an economic agenda as reported by the news. And all of them, without exception, missed the largest story of the 21st century, which is the near collapse of the financial system. Take the New York Times, which has a strapline, all the news that's fit to print. It's the most asinine strapline ever invented. I mean, really? All the news that's fit to print? Are you sure, you guys? Like, have you checked it out? So there they were in 2006, all the news that's fit to print, and they were, 15 blocks from Wall Street, and these guys missed the whole story. And yet they still keep up the masthead. So in other words, we as the audience need to keep our wits about us, because no one has managed to capture in a neat vessel all the news that's fit to print. It doesn't happen. We need to keep an eye out.
Okay. Again, arguably, there's more and more people saying, what you're saying, which is like the news is just some of the news. I don't watch it, whatever. I don't read it. I don't need it, whatever they're going to argue. In 2014, how much faith do you think the public still puts in the news?
Too much. It still puts too much. We still, for all our skepticism, the lead stories still are the ones that people talk about. Very rarely do you find kind of mass disobedience to the news agenda. Most of us bow down to the news agenda. We talk about what the news agenda wants us to talk about, etc. And let's remember also that if you go to most of the newsrooms in Canada and elsewhere, what are people watching? The news by other people. So in other words, it's a cohesive block of opinion about what is news, what should be reported, etc. Depart from that at your peril. So I'm drawing attention, I guess, to the unbelievable consensus. Even in a kind of multipolar age when everyone's got a Twitter account, it still remains massively cohesive.
And where do you cast that blame or responsibility? Because a lot of people would say, well, this is a concentration of the media. This is why we're all doing the same thing, and you're only getting a certain dose of news.
Yeah. So there's broadly speaking the conspiracy theorists, led probably by Chomsky in his view, and the view there is that the news agenda is shaped by economic interests, normally run by elderly white gentlemen with very powerful economic interests. I think it's even worse than that. Yes, those interests do govern a lot of what we read and see, but there's also a kind of mass self-censorship that goes on in the media. There's a lack of questioning of certain norms. I think it's people censor themselves as much as anybody else actively censors them. And look, I think, let's be hopeful. We do live in a free society. There's a lot of spare capital around. There's a lot of ingenious people. What we've got to crack now for the news is how do you make progressive news, in other words, news that's on the side of good things, like truth, justice, beauty, kindness, compassion, all the things that you and I believe in, right? I'm imagining. How can we give those things weight in the world? How can we make sure that the news isn't just always about, the hopeless, the violent, without any possibility of redemption, that celebrity stories don't lead anywhere? I'm a real fan of celebrity. I think the concept of celebrity is a really important one. Societies need celebrities, but is it always got to be Kim Kardashian and always for those things that she does? Or could there be other ways of respecting people, of holding up people to public esteem? Because that's what celebrity is.
I want to pick, I think you use a number of words, but let's just list compassion, beauty, things that we all believe in. Kind of a two-pronged question. One is that might be sort of subjective in what we define as ourselves as beauty or compassion. And also I think most news organizations would say, we do that. Let me give you an example. Yep. Child gets murdered, which we see all the time on the news. Okay, the next day's story is about the life that this child led, the grief of her family. And I think arguably people would say, well, that is us showing compassion to what happened.
Absolutely. Look, I'm not saying that everything's gone wrong. Some really good things, absolutely. But all I'm saying is there is in the news, especially in very serious news organizations, an idea that there must be no bias in the news. The good, good news organizations is not biased. And people will say Fox News is biased and, Daily Mail in Britain is biased. But the good organizations like CBC, like your station, like BBC in the UK, these are non-biased organizations. I'm a bit wary of this argument because I think the goal isn't just to have no bias, it's to have the right kind of bias. In other words, in a noisy world, when organizations like the BBC report news without, a guy in the BBC told me the other day, he said, we've tried strenuously not to have an opinion on anything. The last time we had an opinion on something was apartheid. And we decided after much internal soul searching that we were against it. But other than that, they tend to always want to balance everything up. So it's like if you have somebody who's pro-genocide, you might have somebody who's anti-genocide. If you have somebody who's anti-genital mutilation, you might have somebody who's pro-genital. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but they constantly try and make everything balanced. And I don't think that the truth necessarily is always balanced, and people's interests are not always balanced. An organization which is scrupulously has a scrupulous requirement of constant balance will never change anything, because then it becomes a totally conservative force, because you can't change anything. Should we redistribute wages? Well, some people say this and some people say that. You're never going to get anywhere. So I think that we need organizations that have got a take on the world, rather than this kind of bland idea of, rather than the bad guys at Fox News having a really powerful agenda and pushing it down your throat. And then, the good guys just being so careful not to upset anyone, so careful not to advance any agenda, so careful merely to go on the one hand and on the other hand. It's harmful, I think, for society.
How do you see the modus operandi then of a news organization? What should it be?
I think a news organization's highest responsibility is to the nation and the individuals who make it up, and that the news should give us, as individuals and as a nation, the information we need to flourish. And you could go, what on earth does that mean? Well, I think that the information we need to flourish is going to take many forms. Sometimes that'll be good news, sometimes that'll be bad news, sometimes it'll mean bringing someone down, sometimes it'll mean raising someone up. But what I mean is that we need a compass to guide us. I've hung around news organizations, and a news story comes in, and they'll go, okay, we should put that on first, and then I'll say, why are you putting that story first and that story second? And they'll go, I don't know, it's just like, this is a feel, that's like how we do it. And what I'm struck, as a guy coming from a philosophical background, is how little thought there is given to the idea that the news can create an agenda. That means of all the billions of events that take place at any point in the world, the news organizations can pick some out in order to drive forward an argument about how life is, how life should be, what needs to be done. And I'm just struck by the randomness of current news, the way in which the sense of what is important isn't properly examined. And so you get these weird kind of hierarchies, it's like, that kid's been murdered, 400 people have been killed, but they're in Africa, so we're not going to talk about them. And it's simply unexamined what all this information is for in our brains. Like, why are you telling me this? And the reason for this is that news grew up. First of all, we're only at the beginning of the world of news. I mean, news as we know it is about 150 years old. That's nothing. That's a blink of an eye. In other words, we're still trying to work out what do we need? And a lot of what we call news is really news for governments in order to help them run, the foreign service, bits of the economy, etc. Without a real sense of what does the citizen need in all this. My book is an attempt to kind of go through a range of areas and say, okay, let's try and ask, what is economic news? What is celebrity news? What are murder stories really about? How should we look at data, news that's around data, etc. So I run through a range of areas and try and just ask myself a question, which is, what could this be?
You mentioned Fox News, so I'm going to use that example. I used to work for Fox News, total transparency, when I lived in the Middle East. often people say, well, that's just right-wing, or the CBC's just left-wing. And it raises the question of bias. And I want to talk to you about that because, I mean, don't people just visit the news to confirm what they already believe, whether it's political or religious or social bias? Isn't that why we just turn it on and say, yes, this is what I believe, there it is, confirmed?
Well, I think there is definitely a minority that has very strong beliefs, and they go to the channel that will back up those beliefs. But I believe that is still the minority. The mainstream, I think, is kind of swimming around with lots of sort of thoughts and has a broad belief that the news is just a kind of neutral and fair representation of what is important. And I think that's too loose, you know, because news organizations need to ask themselves, what is important? What do we believe in? I think it's okay to have an agenda. It's fine to have an agenda. And I think, you know, one of my favorite publications is The Economist. Now, the reason I like The Economist is not that I always agree with it. It's just that these guys, from page 1 to the end of the magazine, every week, they decide, it's totally ideological. They've got a view of the world, and they drive it through every single story. You don't have to agree with it, but it actually brings stuff out. If they merely were like just you know, writing stories in the standard, rather bland, rather neutral way, you wouldn't see the issues. If somebody's got a take on something, you start to see the issues more clearly. And you don't necessarily believe it. I mean, you can spot bias a million miles away. You know, bias is something we grow up knowing how to spot. I mean, I've got small children. I keep giving them a biased view of fruit and vegetables. Like I tell them, you know, if you eat this vegetable, you know, you'll grow big and strong and you won't die of scurvy. And they don't listen. So because they've spotted bias. And we all know about bias. And I think there's a slightly patronizing view sometimes that audiences can't spot bias. So you need utter neutrality. My view is more bias but better one. In other words, news that has a vision of how it wants the world to be and what it believes in. A coherent vision that it can articulate to its audience. I mean, what I like about Fox News is it has a take on the world. I don't agree with it at all, but I at least admire the energy with which these guys have got a vision of life.
My journalist friends and I always talk about it in Britain, for example. At least you know the papers all come from a certain political bias, or at least are described that way. So you know what you're getting. So you know where the quote unquote their truth is coming from. Whereas in North America, you know, everyone fends off this. We don't have a bias. We are just telling the quote unquote truth.
Right, which is even more puzzling. Let me also say that, you know, we've got this view that there's really only two kinds of bias, right-wing bias and left-wing bias. That's a real impoverishment of the possibilities of bias. I mean, imagine if you're a Buddhist, right? If you're a Buddhist, you could imagine a newspaper, a news organization that has a Buddhist bias. In other words, it's constantly scanning the world, looking out for moments of compassion, looking out for forgiveness, analyzing news organizations as a refusal to accept the inherent nature of suffering, or whatever. Imagine if you had a Freudian news organization that is looking at the news through a Freudian lens, or a news organization that's inspired by Tolstoy and looks at Tolstoy. I mean, you could go on and on. What I'm simply saying is, it's so bizarre that it's almost like there's only two ways of looking at the world. Either, you know, it's Milton Friedman or it's Karl Marx. It's like, guys, there's other ways, there's other agendas, and they somehow don't make it through the news.
I want to bring up a headline that you raised. This is from the BBC last year. Here's a headline. It says, tenants rent arrears soar in pilot benefits scheme. What emotions do headlines like this provoke in the online reader?
One of the areas I wanted to look at in the book is what we call boring news, because it's kind of not generally discussed, but a lot of news is found boring by people, particularly so-called serious issues. And we can track it by looking at how many people click on whatever. And on the BBC website, it's hilarious because there's always a big story, like that story about, you know, rent arrears and pilot schemes, etc. And they put that on the front page. And then you look at most read, and it's always things like, you know, cannibal eats his girlfriend, and, you know, dog goes missing. And that's what people love, and the rent arrears goes missing. So what can we learn from this? How can we, you know, make sense of this? So one view is the despair of human beings. We're just crude and crass, and we don't pay attention to what's really important. But I'm really sympathetic to boredom in news, and I think boredom is a story that hasn't been told to you properly. And sometimes the most serious news journalists will simply think in their hearts that the work they're doing is so important that they don't need to do any more work to make sure the audience understands that it's very important. And that's why you get situations like the Guardian newspaper in the UK, a so-called serious newspaper that is about to go broke, that's losing £40 million a year, because it hasn't found a way to make the important interesting. And this is a real challenge, and journalists feel quite confused about this because they say things like, We're not entertainers. We're not creative writers. We're journalists, truth tellers. We just get you the truth. And then if the truth is important, you will listen. Well, no, I'm sorry, guys. It's not going to happen. Because when you're competing with, Taylor Swift and the latest move in the Kardashians, you've got to make sure that your story about, some element of housing subsidy or something going on in Parliament, that is against, unbelievable competition. Now, it's not an impossible task. It just requires artistry. You need to be able to make your story fascinating.
Okay, these are all words that make the traditional journalists bristle. Yeah. Creative writing, art. News has an obligation to be truthful. Agreed?
Absolutely.
Okay, how can a journalist then be more creative when telling a story that is based on facts?
There's the facts, and then how you arrange them. The facts are not made to be arranged in only one way. There's no such thing as like the truth and then there's creative writing. Everything can be creatively arranged. Journalists are making millions of decisions, but many, many journalists don't really know how to write very well. And so in my book, I talk about the way in which Italian politics bores everybody outside of Italy. If you're a newspaper, news organization, and you run a story about what's going on in the Italian Senate, everybody literally falls asleep because it's so complicated. There are so many characters. They're all scheming and stabbing each other in the back, and it's just, you can't make head or tail of it, and it's so boring. Could take an audience to Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare. They're all gripped, and it's stuff that's going on in the Senate with people stabbing each other and political machinations, etc., and we're gripped. Now, why? Because Shakespeare was a genius. Now, I'm not saying that Shakespeare should sit in the modern newsroom, but we should take certain lessons. How do you make a story interesting? Vice magazine, Vice.com, the news organization, went out to Syria about a year ago and started writing about Syria in a way which brought a whole lot of people into that story. Because they ran stories. There was a famous story that won all sorts of prizes, and it was called Having an Ice Cream with a Suicide Bomber, in which a young American journalist goes to try and have an ice cream with a suicide bomber. Now, the New York Times wouldn't cover it like that, etc. You need nowadays, I'm not really being cute, but if an issue is very important, you need to touch the hearts and minds of people. We live in a democracy. In other words, we need the most important stories to get a mass support. How are you going to do that? I mean, take the recent coverage that's been going on in the Ukraine, etc. A lot of that just doesn't even begin to know how to get people interested in the subject, because it parachutes you in, it gives you no context, it gives you no local color. Think of the disaster news that comes out of Africa. So we hear lots of stories. The moment there's stuff going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo, lots of terrible stuff. People don't care. Why don't they care? Because no one's ever told them anything about the Democratic Republic of Congo. All that we tell our listeners and our viewers is, 300 people died in a massacre in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And you think, well, I don't care. What's that about? Because there's no context. There's no, they haven't entered your imagination. In order to care about people's disasters, you need to know about their lives. And if you have news organizations that only tell you about the disaster, we don't care.
We only have a couple of minutes left, but I want to ask you, first of all, we've been talking a lot about the deliverable side, so the journalists and the news organization responsibility. What's the responsibility of we, the consumer?
Okay, you have to realize the stuff has the power to drive you crazy. It's really powerful. A few moments with the news can fundamentally reorient and rewire your priorities for that day and that moment. So take care. Most of us nowadays, the last person we see at night, the first person we see in the morning is our smartphone. We communicate, and we use the news as an endless way of dampening down anxiety. Why are so many of us now unable to sleep? Why is there so much insomnia? I think insomnia is the revenge of all those thoughts that you didn't have time in the day, coming up at night, wanting to make themselves heard. And what's stopping these thoughts, those conversations with ourselves from taking place during the day? It's the ubiquity of news. It's the fact that all the time you can pretend to be a serious person by sitting down with your phone and looking at the headlines. Well, seriousness takes many forms, and it's not necessarily that you're honoring your duties to yourself, your nations, your family by sitting down with your phone and reading the latest headlines. Actually, sometimes we need to have those conversations with ourselves. So a little bit of guidance in how to consume this stuff is deeply important.
Okay, you raised the flag of news in this book. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the therapeutic value of art. And I want to see if there's any link between the two as you see what news might be able to learn, draw from the art world.
Well, art is news made powerful. Okay, art, is news that will always stay news. That's the cliched remark. And I think that artists are often treating exactly the same subjects of news organizations, but they're going deeper and they touch us more. And I think that news organizations need to learn from art. They need to make art, but they need to learn from art.
I like this book. As much as I kind of bristled at parts, well, it made me think about what I do for a living. So thank you for writing it, and
Thank you so
hopefully we'll
much.
do better. Thanks, Alain.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.